I had always loved mornings on my property. The sun would just start to peek over the hills, birds would chirp in that perfect, chaotic harmony, and I'd sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, feeling like the king of my little piece of the world. My land wasn't huge, but it was mine, every inch of it fenced, cared for, and exactly how I wanted it. I'd built it up over the years, added trees, a small garden, and even a little shed where I kept tools and memories alike. It was peaceful. It was private, and as I would soon find out, it was a battlefield waiting to happen. I had always had a, let's call it, complicated relationship with the HOA, mostly minor annoyances at first, a letter here about a bush being a bit too tall, a note there about paint color not quite matching the community aesthetic, but I had learned to laugh them off. After all, the rules seemed more like suggestions when it came to common sense. I prided myself on keeping everything within legal bounds. The last thing I expected was that those letters, those tiny, seemingly harmless notes, were just the opening act for something much bigger. That morning started like any other. I was sipping my coffee, staring at the dew on the grass when movement caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a delivery truck or maybe a neighbor taking a stroll, but no, there at the edge of my property stood two men, uniformed, dark blue, badges gleaming in the early sunlight, and the letters HOA were emblazoned clearly on their backs. I blinked, thinking maybe I was still half asleep, but nope, they were real, and they were heading straight for me. Clipboard in hand, pens ready, and that look on their faces, the one that says they are about to lecture you about something you didn't even know was wrong, made my stomach twist. For a second, I just froze, trying to assess the situation. Were they here to inspect something minor again? Were they planning to enforce some bizarre regulation about the angle of my garden gnome? I tried to smile politely, thinking maybe I can charm them like I usually do. But as I watched them approach, it became clear this wasn't a routine visit. They stopped at the gate, exchanging a glance that was equal parts authority and uncertainty. I could feel the tension radiating off them, and maybe, just maybe, I felt a tiny smirk creeping across my face. There was something almost cinematic about it, two officers of the HOA, clipboard warriors, standing there as if they owned the place, and me, the homeowner, quietly confident that I knew a little something they didn't. I sipped my coffee again, slower this time, letting the moment stretch. I could see the top officer shifting from one foot to the other, adjusting his badge like that would make him look more powerful. His partner was scanning the fence, probably calculating the best way to approach me. And me, I was just standing there enjoying my private little standoff, mentally rehearsing the words I might say, words that would stop them dead in their tracks. I had no idea, of course, that this moment would escalate far beyond a simple boundary dispute, that the letters they had sent, the rules they cited, and the authority they flaunted would crumble the instant I spoke. But I had a plan. A simple plan: stand my ground, be calm, be firm, and if necessary, make them realize that this land was mine and no clipboard or badge could change that. They moved a little closer. Their eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked between me and the gate. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads, and then something in their posture shifted. Maybe it was the way I leaned against the railing, sipping my coffee as if nothing could touch me, or maybe it was the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you're legally untouchable. Whatever it was, I could tell they were already starting to hesitate. Little did they know, the words that would freeze them in their tracks were just about to leave my lips. And once I said them, there would be no turning back. The officers stood there just beyond the gate, their clipboards held like shields and their faces set in the kind of stern expressions that suggest they think they own the world. I put down my coffee, straightened my back, and walked slowly toward the porch railing. Every step I took was deliberate, calm, measured, the kind of movement that says, I know something you don't. Good morning, one of them said, his voice clipped but attempting friendly authority. We're here to conduct an inspection of your property. There have been reports of violations. I raised an eyebrow. Violations? I echoed, my voice even, a hint of amusement creeping in. I get letters from you every now and then, but I don't remember signing up for surprise visits. The second officer fumbled with his pen, glancing down at the clipboard as if it might offer him magical guidance. We just need to make sure everything complies with the HOA rules. It's for everyone's benefit. I tried to keep my tone light, though there was a tightening in my chest. I see, so you're here to inspect my perfectly legal property without permission, and I'm supposed to just nod politely? I let a small smile slip. Sounds reasonable. Neither of them smiled back, that much was clear. I could feel the tension humming in the air, like static before a storm. It wasn't just about the property anymore, it was about control, authority, and to their disappointment, I wasn't about to hand either over without a fight. The first officer stepped closer, clipboard extended like a shield. We're just doing our job, this is standard procedure, please allow us onto your property. I let out a short laugh, not loud, but sharp enough to catch them off guard. You want to walk onto my property just like that? I gestured to the fence and the gate. Do you have a warrant, some sort of official order, or are we just going to pretend that a clipboard makes you the sheriff of my land? They exchanged a nervous glance. I could see their confidence wobbling ever so slightly, though they tried hard to mask it. There was a moment of silence, filled only by the morning birds, which seemed ironically cheerful given the tension. Sir, the second officer finally said, clearing his throat, we can't exactly give you a legal warrant, but the HOA has the right to enforce rules. Right to enforce rules? I interrupted, stepping closer, letting my calmness contrast with their sudden fluster. You mean the right to trespass on private property because you don't like how I maintain it? Or because my paint color is exactly what the rulebook prescribes? I let my words hang in the air, letting them chew on the reality that I knew my rights better than they knew their own rules. Their hands twitched nervously, one clutched the clipboard tighter, the other adjusted the badge on his chest, like it would magically grant him authority. I couldn't help but notice their hesitancy. For a moment, the roles were reversed. I was in control, calm, and unwavering, while they were starting to second-guess themselves. I took another deliberate step forward, stopping just short of the gate. You know, there's something about my land that seems to confuse visitors like you. It's called ownership. It's written in the deed, filed with the county, signed, sealed, legally recognized. Funny how that works, isn't it? The first officer's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I could almost hear the internal panic. Do we enforce the rules anyway? Will this escalate? Did we read the deed correctly? I let a small smirk slip, sipping my coffee like it was a shield. Look, I said, voice steady and calm, I'm more than happy to talk about minor issues. I'm not unreasonable, but walking onto my property uninvited, that's a hard no. The second officer shifted his weight, glancing at the first. I could see the tension radiating between them. Their carefully rehearsed script was crumbling, and I knew right then that the next words I said could decide how this confrontation would go. I took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline kick in just slightly, enough to sharpen my focus. My gaze locked on the first officer, and I prepared to say something that would stop them in their tracks. Words that, in my mind, were simple, declarative, and unshakable. Words that would define this standoff and make them realize they had underestimated me. And then I leaned back, sipped my coffee one last time, and opened my mouth. Oh, this land is mine. I let the words hang in the morning air, calm, steady, simple. This land is mine. For a moment, nothing happened. And then I saw it, the subtle shift in their posture, the slight falter in their step, the way the clipboard trembled in the first officer's hand. I could practically hear the gears turning in their heads. Did he just? The first officer's eyes widened, his authoritative mask slipping for the briefest second. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Sir, we were just here to inspect. Inspect, I echoed, my voice quiet but firm. So you expect to walk onto my property, pull out your clipboards, and act like this is a routine check, that I'm supposed to just comply because your badge says HOA? I let my hands rest on my hips, leaning forward slightly, calm, unthreatening, but unyielding. I've read the deed, I know the boundaries, and I know the law. You're standing on private property, and that is not negotiable. The second officer shuffled his feet, glancing nervously at his partner. I could see the panic rising, masked by forced composure. One of them opened his mouth to argue, but I cut him off with a raised hand. Let me make this simple. I respect rules. I respect the HOA when it makes sense, but I do not respect trespass. You do not have permission to enter, and frankly, if you step 1 foot past that gate, you will be violating the law. The tension in the air was palpable. I could almost feel the sweat forming on the back of their necks, even though it was a crisp morning. Their plan, whatever they thought it was unraveling in real time, and I had to admit, a small, private part of me was relishing it. The first officer cleared his throat again, glancing at the second. We just need to verify compliance. It's for the community's benefit. I let out a short laugh, dry, incredulous. For the community's benefit, I shook my head slowly. Look around, this isn't about the community, this is about control, about enforcing rules that frankly make no sense on land that isn't yours. For a second, I saw uncertainty flicker in their eyes, and that was my opening. Calmly, I gestured to the fence posts that marked my property lines. See these markers? They're official, filed, recorded, recognized. Every inch beyond them, yours is a suggestion, mine is reality. I could almost hear the mental scrambling. Maybe they were asking themselves, do we call the cops? Do we risk being sued? Are we actually trespassing? I smiled to myself. This was working. Every word, every gesture was shifting the balance. Then the second officer tried a new tactic. Sir, if you don't cooperate, we might have to escalate this. Fines, legal action. I shook my head slowly. Escalate by trespassing, by threatening a property owner who knows his rights. You might want to check those rules again, or better yet, read your own handbook before trying to intimidate someone. I saw their confidence waver further. The first officer lowered the clipboard slightly, as if the physical weight might ground him. The second officer looked down at the ground, muttering something under his breath. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. The panic in their posture spoke volumes. For a moment the world seemed to slow. Birds still chirped, sunlight glinted off the metal fence, and the morning breeze rustled the leaves. And then I realized I had them exactly where I wanted. Not through aggression, not through threats, but through calm, unshakable assertion of what was mine. I leaned back against the railing, letting my stance communicate what my words already had. I wasn't backing down, I wasn't intimidated. And no clipboard, no badge, no rulebook was going to change that. Their eyes flicked to each other, searching for guidance, for a way to regain control. But the truth was simple, and it had never been more clear. They had underestimated me. They had come expecting compliance and instead found someone who knew exactly what he was defending. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of my presence settle over the standoff. I knew the next move would be theirs, and whatever it was, I was ready. Because one thing had become abundantly clear. On my property, the rules were mine, the land was mine, and I was not about to let anyone take that away. For a moment, everything was still. The officers lingered at the gate, caught between authority and hesitation, and I leaned casually against my railing, watching them like a hawk. The quiet hum of the morning made the tension almost surreal. I could feel it stretching, thick and heavy, like fog settling over the property. Every step they took seemed measured, cautious, almost like they weren't sure if the ground beneath their boots actually belonged to them. The first officer finally cleared his throat, the clipboard shaking slightly in his hand. "Sir, we can work this out. Perhaps we can inspect a portion of the property just to verify." I held up a hand, smiling faintly, though my eyes were sharp. "Nope, not happening. I've been nothing but polite, calm, and reasonable. And yet here you are, trying to walk onto private property without permission. That's not reasonable, that's trespassing." The second officer muttered under his breath, glancing at his partner. I caught a glimpse of frustration, tinged with disbelief. I could almost hear them thinking, who is this guy? The birds didn't stop chirping, the wind didn't pause, but I swear the air between us was electric. Neighbors from nearby started to peek over fences and out of windows. Some had seen me walking toward the porch earlier and now seemed intrigued. I could feel their eyes on the scene, silent witnesses to what was quickly turning into a standoff. "You really think standing here, arms crossed, is going to resolve this?" the first officer asked, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. I shrugged, tilting my head slightly. "I think standing here, arms crossed, and not letting you violate the law is a very effective strategy. You should try it sometime." I could see his jaw tighten. The second officer shifted from one foot to the other, as if unsure whether to advance, retreat, or call for backup. Their confidence, which had seemed absolute minutes ago, was slipping like sand through fingers. Then came the subtle changes, the way their eyes darted to the fence markers I had pointed out earlier, the small hesitations in their steps, the clipped murmurs they tried to hide. Every move they made showed uncertainty. And I realized with a quiet thrill that I wasn't just defending my property anymore, I was controlling the narrative of the entire encounter. The first officer's voice dropped lower, almost a growl. "Sir, please, this isn't personal, it's about rules, compliance." I leaned forward slightly, hands resting on the railing, and let my gaze lock with his. Calm, unwavering, unflinching. "It is personal, it's about my home, my land, my rights, and if you think compliance means stepping onto my property uninvited, you are sorely mistaken." I could see the confusion in his eyes, the micro-expressions that betrayed uncertainty. Their entire script was falling apart. They had expected obedience, compliance, maybe even a little flustered apology. Instead, they were facing someone who refused to back down, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. From the corner of my eye, I noticed one of the neighbors smirking behind a fence post, silently cheering me on. Another neighbor peeked through a window, shaking their head in disbelief. I didn't blame them. If I were watching this scene from the outside, I might have thought it was part of a movie. Except, unlike a movie, no director could have scripted this tension. I decided to keep the pressure on. "Look, I get it. You have rules, you have letters, you have authority. But none of that gives you the right to step on my land uninvited. And trust me, escalating this standoff is the last thing you want to do." There was a flicker in their eyes, fear, hesitation, a realization that this wasn't going to end the way they expected. They shuffled their feet again, glanced at each other, and I could practically hear the mental debate. Do we risk it? Do we retreat? Are we overstepping? I sipped my coffee, letting my calmness contrast with their nervous energy. Every second stretched the tension, and every second made it more obvious who was in control. And then, as if reading the same thought, the first officer finally muttered, We'll leave a note." A note, nothing more. A feeble attempt at authority that carried zero weight in the face of clear ownership. I watched them step back, muttering to each other, retreating toward their car. For the first time, I realized just how much power a calm mind, a firm stance, and an unshakable understanding of your rights could hold. But I also knew this was far from over. They would be back, or worse, they would try something new, something I hadn't anticipated, and when that happened, I would have to be ready. Because on my land, I didn't just defend my property. I defended my peace, my rules, and the quiet mornings I loved so dearly, and I wasn't about to let a clipboard and a badge ruin any of it. The moment they left, I didn't relax. In fact, I felt a rush of adrenaline that made my hands twitch slightly. This wasn't over. They had retreated, sure, but that note they left behind, the thinly veiled threat, told me everything I needed to know. The HOA thought they could push me around, maybe try a sneak attack next time, and I wasn't about to let that happen. Not on my land, not in my home. I went inside and grabbed my laptop, pulling up the property deed, maps of my land, and local regulations. Every line, every clause, every corner of that property was now etched into my mind. I knew exactly what was mine, and I wasn't leaving anything to chance. I started taking photos of the property lines, the gates, the fences, even the spots they might claim were violations. Documentation was power, and power was about to become my greatest ally. Then I took another step, subtle but crucial. I installed cameras at the entrances, not for paranoia but for protection. If they tried to sneak in, I wanted proof. If they escalated, I needed evidence. The cameras were small, almost invisible, but they captured everything, every footstep, every whisper, every nervous glance. It felt satisfying, like setting traps for a wolf without ever showing my hand. Next, I made a few phone calls. One to a local attorney who specialized in property rights, another to a friend who had dealt with HOA nonsense before. Both reassured me, telling me exactly what I already knew. They had no legal authority to enter my land without permission. But even with legal advice, I didn't want to wait for threats or fines. I wanted to be proactive. By the time I returned to the porch, clipboard in hand myself, though technically just a notebook for notes, not a badge, I felt ready. I walked the perimeter of the property, checking fences, gates, and any weak points that might invite another surprise visit. Every step I took was deliberate. Calm, confident, measured. I wanted to show even to myself that I was in control. The next morning, I caught movement at the far end of the driveway. My stomach tightened slightly, but I didn't panic. Instead, I smiled. Sure enough, the HOA had sent someone to inspect the property again, probably thinking I'd be intimidated. They didn't see the cameras, the documentation, or the planning I'd done. They didn't see the resolve that had settled into my bones. When they approached the gate, I stepped out, holding my coffee like a shield and a sign of peace. "Good morning," I said casually, though my tone carried a subtle steel underneath. "I see you're back. What's the plan today?" The first officer's eyes flicked to the cameras, then to the fences, then finally back to me. I could see the calculations running in his head, weighing risk versus reward, questioning whether the last visit had been a fluke or a warning. The second officer, clipboard now trembling even more than before, avoided eye contact. Their confidence was eroding, slowly but surely. I let them talk themselves into a corner. Their arguments about community benefit and rule enforcement sounded tinny, almost desperate. I answered calmly, every word measured. "I respect the HOA, I respect rules, but I don't respect trespassing, and if you try again, I will have no choice but to document everything and escalate legally." By the time they left, muttering threats under their breath, I felt an unusual satisfaction. Not victory yet, but preparation. This was chess, not checkers. I had set the board, positioned my defenses, and now it was just a matter of time before the next move. And when that move came, I would be ready. I spent the rest of the day reviewing my notes, double-checking legal references, and rehearsing possible scenarios in my mind. Each possible approach, each potential trick the HOA might use, I anticipated. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was preparing for a war of wits, patience, and legal knowledge. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, I stood on my porch once more, coffee in hand, surveying the land. My property looked peaceful, serene, untouched by the tension of the morning, but I knew better. Beneath that calm surface, a battle was brewing, one that I intended to win. And in that quiet moment, I allowed myself a small, private grin. The HOA had underestimated me. They had assumed compliance. They had assumed fear. They were about to find out exactly what happens when someone knows their rights, stands firm, and refuses to be intimidated. Because on my land, I wasn't just a homeowner, I was a guardian, and I wasn't going anywhere. I had barely settled in with my coffee that morning when I saw the first signs of trouble. A letter had been slipped under my gate, crisp and official looking, the kind of document designed to intimidate without actually having any teeth. Noncompliance, it read, failure to adhere to HOA guidelines may result in legal action. I held it up, read it once, then twice. A small, bitter laugh escaped me. Legal action, trespassing, they had no idea. It was clear now they weren't going to give up, not quietly, not reasonably. They were escalating, testing the boundaries, trying to see if persistence could override legality. And that meant it was time for me to respond in kind, calmly, firmly, and with the advantage of knowing I had the law, documentation, and preparation on my side. I grabbed my laptop and double-checked my property boundaries, ensuring every corner, every fence post, every line on the deed was clear and accounted for. Photos, maps, and records were pulled up, annotated, and filed. I even took screenshots of past communications, letters, and HOA notices, turning what they thought was intimidation into ammunition for my defense. Then I turned my attention to the practical side. The cameras were already in place, but I adjusted angles, ensuring no footstep would go unnoticed. Gates were double-checked, locks tested. I even added a few warning signs, subtle, legal, but enough to make anyone think twice. Private property, trespassers will be documented. Simple, firm, effective. By late morning, I was ready for whatever trick they might try next. And as if on cue, movement appeared at the end of the driveway. Two figures approached, this time carrying what looked like clipboards, cameras, and a confidence that seemed just a little forced. They weren't coming with authority alone, they were coming with intimidation tactics, hoping to rattle me into compliance. I stepped forward, coffee in hand, a calm smile on my face. "Morning," I said, as if we were all just neighbors having a chat about landscaping. "I see you're back. Let me guess, the deed wasn't clear enough the first time." The first officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, we just need to ensure compliance." I tilted my head, letting my calmness contrast with the nervous twitch in his hands. "Compliance," I repeated. "Right, you want to step onto my land without permission, I get it, but rules without consent are just suggestions, and trespassing is still illegal." The second officer shifted uneasily. His confidence, which had been bolstered in their office, was cracking under the weight of reality. I could practically see the calculations running through his head. Do we call the police? Do we escalate? Are we overstepping? I let the tension stretch, savoring the psychological upper hand. Every moment I stayed calm, every step I didn't flinch reinforced who was in control, and I could see it reflected in their eyes, doubt, hesitation, the faint spark of panic. They tried another tactic, a thinly veiled threat about fines and legal proceedings, hoping to make me flinch. I just shook my head. "I've read the laws, I've documented everything, and I've taken every precaution. If you try anything here, you're not enforcing rules, you're creating a lawsuit." A silence followed, thick and tense, broken only by the soft wind rustling through the trees. Birds chirped in the distance, oblivious to the drama unfolding below. I caught a glimpse of a neighbor peering over a fence, shaking their head. I could almost hear them thinking they didn't expect him to fight back like this. By midday, they had retreated again, muttering threats under their breath, scrawling notes, and probably calling the HOA office for advice. But this retreat wasn't defeat, it was confirmation. I was winning. Calm, methodical, prepared, and fully aware of my rights, I had forced them to pause, reconsider, and rethink their tactics. I leaned back against the porch railing, sipping my coffee, letting the morning sun warm my face. The property looked serene, peaceful, untouched by the tension that had just passed. But I knew better. The HOA wasn't done. They would be back, trying something new, maybe more aggressive, maybe more creative. And I was ready. Because every action they took, every attempt to intimidate had only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't just defending property anymore. I was defending principle, knowledge, calmness under pressure. And with every passing day, I became more confident that the next confrontation, the inevitable showdown, would be theirs to lose. I smiled faintly, almost to myself. Let them try. Let them come back thinking they had the advantage. I had the law, the evidence, and the patience. And on my land, patience was a weapon, one I intended to wield with precision. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the next move would be theirs. The morning sun hit my property like a spotlight, casting long shadows across the driveway. I knew today was the day. The HOA officers were back, and this time their approach carried a weight of finality I hadn't seen before. They weren't just testing me anymore, they were attempting to take control, to assert authority, to finally break me. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, my gaze steady and unwavering. From the end of the driveway, I saw them pause, taking in the cameras, the gates, the meticulously maintained property lines I had documented so thoroughly. They were calculating, uncertain, and just a little intimidated. The first officer, clipboard in hand, opened his mouth to speak but hesitated mid-sentence. "Sir," he finally said, trying to sound commanding, "we're here to enforce the rules. Step aside and allow us entry." I shook my head slowly, letting my calm confidence fill the space between us. "I've been polite, I've been reasonable, and I've stood by the law every step of the way, but you are not stepping onto my property without permission. Not today, not ever." The second officer's face tightened, and I noticed the subtle signs of frustration creeping in: twitching fingers, darting eyes, a nervous glance toward his partner. They had prepared for compliance, for excuses, for flinches. What they hadn't prepared for was firm, unwavering resistance backed by evidence, preparation, and absolute knowledge of my rights. I took a slow step forward, calm but deliberate, standing squarely in the middle of the driveway. The officers hesitated, their calculated intimidation faltering under the weight of my certainty. I gestured toward the cameras, which were clearly visible now. "Everything you do, every step you take is being recorded. One wrong move and it's all on tape. You want to be part of that." For a moment, the air was thick with silence. Birds chirped, the wind rustled through the trees, and yet it felt like the entire neighborhood had stopped breathing. The tension was palpable. I could see them glance at each other, their training colliding with reality. Their authority was meaningless here, not because I was aggressive or loud, but because I was calm, prepared, and utterly unshakable. The first officer tried again, his voice slightly shaky. "Sir, if you do not comply, we will escalate this legally. Fines, court proceedings." I leaned against the railing, letting my gaze hold theirs unblinking. "Escalate? You've already lost the moral ground. Trespassing on private property doesn't make you powerful, it makes you liable. And every action you take here is being documented. Step back, reconsider, and then leave before this becomes more complicated than you can handle." I could see the shift immediately. Their calculated bravado was crumbling. The second officer muttered something under his breath and took a step back. The first officer's hand hovered over his clipboard like it was some kind of shield, his confidence evaporating under the weight of reality. They had expected defiance, but not this level of preparation. They had expected intimidation, but not a homeowner who was calm, legal, and utterly resolute. Neighbors had begun to peek out from windows and fences, silent spectators to what was turning into a cinematic standoff. Their faces reflected disbelief, admiration, and a little bit of amusement at the absurdity of the situation. I couldn't help but notice their quiet support. Not that I needed it, I had my evidence, my preparation, and my confidence, but it was satisfying nonetheless. Finally, the first officer's shoulders slumped. He muttered to his partner, who nodded grimly, and they began retreating toward their car. Their attempts at intimidation had failed. Every threat, every citation, every footstep into my property had been countered by preparation, knowledge, and resolve. As they drove away, I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, the tension leaving my shoulders in a rush of relief. The standoff was over for now. I knew they might try again, but one thing was clear: they had underestimated me, and that mistake had cost them control. I stepped back onto the porch, coffee in hand, surveying the land that had almost become a battlefield. It was peaceful, serene, untouched by the tension that had dominated the morning, and yet I felt exhilarated. Today had been a lesson in calm, confidence, and knowing your rights. On my land, the rules were mine, the boundaries were mine, and no badge, no clipboard, no letter, no officer, no matter how determined, could change that. I let myself smile quietly, privately. The HOA might return, might escalate again, but I was ready, because I had already won the most important part of this battle. I had defended my property, my peace, and my principle, and nothing else mattered. The sun had just begun to dip behind the hills, casting a golden glow across my property. It was quiet now, eerily quiet after the tension of the last few weeks. The air smelled of fresh grass and late afternoon warmth, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe without thinking about letters, clipboards, or the next surprise visit. The HOA officers were gone. Their attempts to intimidate had failed spectacularly. I had documented every inch of the property, every interaction, and every threat. Letters had been ignored, fines had been contested, and every footstep they tried to take onto my land had been met with calm, firm resistance. In short, I had won, not with anger, not with shouting or confrontation, but with preparation, knowledge, and confidence. I walked along the fence line, feeling the ground beneath my boots, taking in every familiar tree, every patch of wildflowers, and the small shed that had been my personal fortress of solitude. This land was mine, and not just legally, but in every sense that mattered. I had defended it, I had stood my ground, and I had done so without compromising who I was: calm, reasonable, and unshakable. But I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. The letters, the threats, the clipboards, the walk-ins, it all seemed like something out of a comedy. A very tense, very dramatic comedy, yes, but comedy nonetheless. I imagined them back at the HOA office, muttering about me, trying to figure out how one homeowner had managed to outmaneuver their entire rulebook. I couldn't stop a small laugh from escaping. I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled onto the porch, letting my gaze sweep across the land. It was serene again, untouched by the chaos of confrontation. Birds flitted across the yard, the wind whispered through the trees, and the sun slowly dipped lower, casting shadows that stretched across the garden. It was a perfect evening, and I realized that the struggle had only made me appreciate it more. Reflecting on everything that had happened, I understood something important. Standing your ground isn't about being aggressive or confrontational. It's about knowing your rights, preparing for challenges, and facing them with calm, unshakable confidence. The HOA had thought they could intimidate me, that compliance was guaranteed. They had underestimated the value of preparation, patience, and principle, and in that underestimation, I found victory. I even allowed myself a little humor. I imagined their faces as I had delivered my calm, firm words. "This land is mine." The look of hesitation, the confusion, the subtle panic, priceless. They had expected fear, they had expected flinches, and instead they got certainty, calmness, and preparation. I could almost hear them recounting the story to each other in disbelief. He actually stood his ground and won. The victory wasn't just legal, it was personal. It was about defending my peace, my home, and the quiet mornings I loved so dearly. Every cup of coffee on the porch, every sunset, every breeze through the trees now carried a weight of triumph. I had fought a battle not with brute force, but with clarity, knowledge, and resolve. And then there was the reflection. How easy it would have been to panic, to react with anger, to let the intimidation get the best of me. But by staying calm, documenting everything, and understanding my rights, I had turned what could have been a nightmare into a story of victory. I had turned fear into confidence, threats into lessons, and confrontation into proof that preparation and knowledge always outweigh bluster. I took one last sip of coffee, leaning back in my chair. The air smelled of victory, of home, of land, of quiet defiance that no one could take away. My property was safe, my rules were intact, and the HOA had learned the hard way that not every homeowner could be intimidated. And as I watched the sun disappear behind the hills, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I allowed myself a quiet, private laugh. The HOA may try again someday, perhaps another letter, another attempt at control, but for now, this battle was mine. My land, my rules, my victory. And there was nothing they could do about it. Because at the end of the day, standing your ground isn't just about land or letters or authority. It's about knowing your value, your rights, and your resolve, and never ever backing down. And that, my friends, is how I defended my land, my home, and my peace, and won. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.